This session on Drawline Architecture, Canon Architecture, is the Bauhaus, Bauhaus, in German building house. It was a art school operational from 1919 to 1933 on the crafts and the fine arts. The school became famous for its approach to design and attempted to unify an artistic vision with the principles of mass production and emphasis on function. So all the time we look at the history of architecture, it's impacted by social histories that precede it. So Europe is coming after a war to end all wars in 1918 into 1919. At that time, people coming back from the front, the people that wanted to change society, wanted to react to the possibilities of a new and different future that was safer for mankind. So in 1919, Walter Gropius founded the Bauhaus with principles of having the idea is that their fear that art was losing its purpose in society, its connectivity to the needs of the common man, as well as those who can sort of buy and purchase expensive portraits or paintings. They thought art might take more of a design emphasis on all sections of art. In the beginning, there was no architecture, even though it's known as being the center for architecture and sort of the dawn of the modern movement. But in this case, it was really more about crafts merging with fine arts to create a language that would facilitate a common bond between countries. So it became known as the avant-garde or international style as well. So Gropius worked on it up until 1928. Then he stepped down his leadership. It went to Hans Meyer and then eventually to Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, who will be our next modern master. So the School of Art and Architecture, as Mies introduced architecture in the later 20s, became world-renowned, but then had a short life because the Nazi culture in middle war, between the two world wars, eventually closed the Bauhaus in 1933. So what we're looking at here is an array of modernist boxes that are in a sort of a pinwheel fashion on a site, with studio space and housing for the students, and then actually a track that works through the underside of the building and becomes part of it, so that human movement, whether it's dance or sport, is part of the project here. For instance, there was dance as the first part of the program each morning for all the students. And the students came here, they're really asked to throw away the idea of art history and history in general and think about starting from today and moving forward with ideas. And so the ideas were considered very progressive for the time and evolved into the breadth of how we see the bulk of 20th century architecture perform. So we're going to work with this view shed. If we to meet over to this perspective from the photograph over here with the title Bauhaus, here's one of there's two main entries, one on this corner and one between the two buildings here, which takes you down to the passageway underneath the building, which connects the two wings. So we'll work on this corner here. We'll see a nice break between the gray painted edge to it, the sun hitting this left side, and then the shade side over on the right, casting shadows on some parts of the blocks as we move away. So what we're looking at then is a rotation of the masses on the site, the four-story structure, to right about here, with the backdrop of, as we come closer to the front here, the backdrop of the housing in our background over to the right. So if I can just shift this out of the way here, we could begin with a couple of simple washes. The ideas with the Bauhaus, the color palette for a lot of the artists and designers were really sort of the core three of red, yellow, and blue, which can basically give you all the other colors, but very strikingly, prosaically simplistic that way, with all the ranges of grays between white and black. And so that kind of simplification of that made people think more about the art in terms of being a performance, the harmony between the function of an object or a building and its design. And this has a backdrop and other types of history that lead up to this, but this is sort of the spring point toward the bulk of the modern movement and the international style. So let's do a simple gray wash so we can come back into some ponds that might have been left over from prior work, or you can clean up a whole new one and kind of move through maybe the simplest little blue backdrop, but then go right to your black and start to wash in that pigment. And if you want it a bit milkier, go to the white as well. Until you build up a nice base of gray. And it's not a huge amount of space we're going to cover, so we can use probably the small round brush to bring this all through. And again, test your gray when you're done. Let's see, maybe a little more white. That should do it. Do a test here on eight. It's good for a start. We use that for all the gray in the building, and we'll use, again, a blue shadow cast on it to deepen the gray. And maybe I will shift to the smaller chisel really quickly. We can take care of this a little bit faster that way. So doing both sides here in the sort of the nominal gray that comes down. And we'll have darker sections for the fenestration over here. We'll put in a little bit. And that'll be our start and our principal corner here, which will wrap the rest of the boxes adjacent to it. Now, as each plane changes, this is conceived as one sort of entry volume here. It's got the stair and the entryway, and the connection to the studio space is up on the second, third, and fourth floor there. Each other gray will be a type related to that, so we can go back to the gray pool and make it a bit darker. And then go back to the round tip brush and work our base over here, which should be dark at the base to graphically sort of support the weight of the building as a darker tone. And we'll come back into that fenestration later to add depth to the interior. And then that'll run right up to the edge here. And we'll save at the very end, the only little mark of color is the striking red door at the entry level. And then we have a base of a wall coming over more sort of a functional support building, a one story over to the right, which should be sort of a foreground piece for us. So we can water down that base gray and then complete this zone. And then that'll turn the corner, which we'll hit with our sort of sky blue later as it goes off towards the edge of our sketch. And again, don't worry about how the water moves and kind of shapes. It might settle a little bit deeper in part of it, shows sort of the texture of the concrete wall over the years. The volume behind here is white. The volume either for the housing is It is also white, so what we'll do is simply use the blue of the sky to shadow that a little bit later on. The backdrop over here is also white, but its base, just like the base of the main studio space, is also dark. So we're going to come back with that earlier dark we had used over here and create the base for that building in the distance. Now there are a whole series of sort of industrial products used here. So it's the skin you'd find in industry that makes it support the language of it being sort of a tectonic building and not addressing history or culture or decoration, but just the functionality of it. So the small operable windows are good for ventilation. The movement of portable walls on the inside can either let the natural light in or deny it. So it's an active wall. And basically it's very rough industrial type space where there's no preconception of art for the student to be swayed by in terms of their environment. So it's very neutral in that case, and sense then frees the student to be more innovative. Again, creating this harmony between the function of the object and then its design. How does design actually enhance that? So it's almost like a new guild of craftsmen without class snobbery. That's sort of from a pamphlet that the Bauhaus had put out against expressionism or against historicism. And the crystal cathedral graphic that you'll find about the Bauhaus online is this new generation of the idea of a religion which is without that type of data behind it, but behind the craft of man themselves. So the sculpture rising to heaven out of the hands of a million craftsmen, the crystal symbol of a new faith for the future. And coming after World War I, the war to end all wars, a lot of people globally were looking for a new future to return to, instead of returning back to sort of the 19th century issues they had that brought on World War I. So over on this side, the skin, it's delicate. We're going to finish it off more with line work toward the end, but we need some sort of base valuing. So basically, between the openings of all the windows down there, there's a shaft of structure that runs up through the building. So we're going to treat that with a light gray as well. So rising up along the center of all that industrial grill work we'll put on later, we see some vertical thrust of the concrete framework that rises up in the building. So we'll make sure we articulate that inside the lines that were given as base reference. Obviously, because we're diminishing toward the vanishing point on the left, the structure is thickest here, widest, and it's the same structure going back, but it's going to appear thinner as it drifts away towards the back point. And eventually, the wrap of the skin becomes almost opaque enough because the spacing for that densifies too, so it looks more or less like a wash of tone at that end of it. So we can start at this end and kind of just wash the entire frame of the Bauhaus and then go straight to water and kind of pull that back into the building so it dissipates. So now we start to see some of the white of the mobile partitions behind that screen. So the language, what we start here, kind of dissipates into collapsing on itself in the backdrop. And now we'll go into a little bit more pigment to the black and maybe a little bit of white to neutralize it's more of a gray. As we want to pull in some of the depth of the windows, because they're going to actually certainly frame out the darkest aspect of the building, seeing the interior. So once you have a pool of sort of maybe an 80% black, if you want to make it more of a gray black, add a little bit of white to it. You could bring in some of the blue we use later for the sky. And what we want to do then is dry out. If your pen is too wet because you're going to go in tight spaces now, you can simply then dry it out by taking it to a tissue or use it by drying out the brush on the paper stock so it's got no water in it, and then just hit the tip of the brush with your paint pool. And now we can come into some of the dark areas and show some of the fenestration. And we'll just wash this in as a base and then come back in later with line work to show the industrial grid on top of the dark space inside of it. There's one. There you go. And now this doorway has got a gray door, but it's got a nice cast shadow on there. So we'll start with that, give some depth to that wall. And now all these base units, now that this base wash is dry, can go blacker, darker. And now potentially the white wall that's there for opacity, if they want more controlled artificial light on the inside, not natural light, you can see where some of it's pulled open periodically. So we're going to go within the framework of that space and just zone out a couple areas that might have that dark opening. There seems to be more in this photograph on the second floor than other floors. And we'll just kind of make it random going down. I mean, each studio have its own choice and show that kind of activity across that skin. Then the secondary line we could put on towards the end, we'll tighten that up. And then we can add more edge value too to kind of clean it up and make it more orthographic. So we'll take that same fenestration detail and take it around the corner here to the back building. That'll be an important edge of having the black of those interiors adjacent to our front skin. First, second, and third floors over here. So being functional, each particular part of this building is since almost like a three-dimensional curriculum and admin area that explains how the school is set up by its components. It's not forced into some classical language or something from thousands of years ago in plan type. It's developed as an art object of its own. So it's expressive of how the school works by looking at the masses on the outside. We have an opening panel over here. And a little glimpse of some fenestration going down parallel to this side, the distance. I mean, it takes the same type of language back here on the housing aspect. There is bands of windows that run horizontally here. And now coming off our first modern master, Frank Lloyd Wright, from the turn of the century, some people claim that in 1904, Wright actually designed the first true modern building with the Unity Temple. And because of the advent of more prolific movement of ideas quickly across international cultures through magazines and exhibitions and things, people would have been exposed to Wright's early work. And so the younger architects of Europe were paying attention to what Wright was doing in the Chicago area. And so they'd seen his ideas of extrapolations of Japanese architecture to create three-dimensional space and work with planes in the X, Y, and Z axis and strip them down of excessive historical detail and create that foundation for more and more work in the modern era. So where these combine, then there is a platform that connects these. We see the very tip of here, that's this height. And so that's going to see fenestration beneath it over here. So that's a dark plane on top of our foreground gray box. It's a secondary information as it's back 3 planes away from us, but we will put some detail into it later. But for now, to separate that out, we just need to bring that gray over. And that's kind of our base so far, just to kind of lay out where we want to go eventually. Obviously, our focus is going to be on this corner. We want to make sure this is the sun side over here. And now we're going to interplay the gray arena and kind of turn this into a sketch that is of color. It's not necessarily colorful because the subject's not really intentionally colorful. But if we work with the blues now and use some of the blacks we already have in our pools, we're going to start to work with the shading condition to make this more three-dimensional. So with the black we've got established, we can introduce some of our blues we've used in the first couple sketches. For the sake of shadowing. And again, because this is going to be global across the whole sketch, you want to make sure it's the right tone. So definitely don't go straight to paper ever. Make sure you check this out. And then we'll water it up a bit. Sort of the midnight blue. If you go more blue, you might refer to as a Brittany blue. And then do a couple tests relative to what you've already established in your test. Coming next to it, that might work as a shadow cast. It still retains some of the blue we're going to use in the sky a little bit later on. So I'll add some water to this now to make sure we've got enough to cover our areas. Okay, now since our main shade side over here, is we're going to hit this corner to make sure this is a much brighter gray than that, and then pull it back this way and make it not as dark, but it'll trail back to be more water-based on this edge of the plane. So if we use our smaller chisel brush, we'll simply start on this side. Bring that down. Maybe 2 full strokes of that tone. And then we'll pull it across just with water on the brush. So we'll dissipate it as it moves over this way. So we don't have that line. And if you'd like a little bit darker, just go over the first draw down near the corner. Now in the back of the building, there's a cast shadow right away from the front block next to this secondary function behind the studios. And that's got sort of an angled pitch like that. So we'll take our darker tone again, probably with the round brush now because it's not that expansive in an area, and edge it so that'll pull our front block off the back white block. So we're putting the sun to work now in this next series of washes. There you go. And over on the right side by the housing of the backdrop, these doors access out to a bit of a balcony. So the balcony's got a very slender concrete thickness to it, but it casts a shadow down. So I have the shadow lines in the ink here, which will help make those project. So using our darker blue black, we can come in and show those cast lines for the people that step out towards the sun. Now it's further away, so it won't have the same density, plus it's white, but we still need to have the ability to turn this corner of the backdrop. So we take the same thing and we simply wash it out on one side of the pool. So if the pool itself tilts, all the pigment will go to one corner of it. So you can sort of take the edge of that corner and make a lighter, more transparent version of that shadow, and then start in this upper corner with the pigment, and then simply go to water the rest of the way and draw it back so it kind of gradates out to white again. And that'll help turn that corner around the box as well. And then we have this one little movement of the space in the mass of the building that turns the corner up top here. So we can take that value along this edge of the building. And underside. And then we've got some very dark elements that are projected by this canopy. And that's going to work basically flat across the front as it comes across and goes deeper because the door is recessed. And then once this dries, we'll be able to cut an angle as this reduces the light on this back plane as well. So not only does it turn the corner away from the sun, but also then creates less light access and makes this plane project out. So we can come to our darkest area here under this plane and then step down the value. So when you get to the opening of the door, it's a bit deeper in the plane. Okay, as that sets up now, because we don't want to do too much more detail on the building while the wash is still a bit wet, we can move to some notion of the sky in the background. And because it is, again, a very neutral building in terms of its color palette, we don't want the sky to be too dominant in blue, but we could come back to a plane of various blues and then just simply water it down so it's more transparent. Like to pick up a little bit of green in that blue too, but you're going to need a healthy amount of water there and pigment because we've got a lot of area to cover. We're not going to go too far up in the sky, up away from the building, because you want this to be a long kind of horizontal final image. Lower the blue black into that to neutralize it. And now what we'll do, we'll try to do this just for the effect so you see the language of it. We'll do a wet on wet wash. So let that sit for a second with your pool of blue. You can test the color to make sure it's the color sky blue you'd like, just something innocuous, and shows the color range. And we'll do the green plane down here for the grass field, which will help warm up the base a bit. So that's ready to go. So what we're going to do first is get clean water. And we're simply going to wash that clean water up in the sky. So it's just a transparent wash of H2O up top for now. So take your largest brush. And we'll move the sketch out of the way down here for now. And we're simply going to take not a lot of water, but just enough to kind of wet the paper and have it become absorptive. We're going to take it right up to the edge of the building because we want the pigment to go up and frame the white face. It'll take probably a minute for the water to actually engage with all the fibers of the paper. Around the other side of this box. And then kind of just up to the top of the paper, go back and forth and push the water so it's even across the whole piece of paper. Then we'll take it down to grade past here a little bit because you can see the horizon line coming down to our eye height here, about just above the, beneath the base windows here. That's where our eye height is as we walked up to the building. The sky is going to come down to that level because Dessau, where this was built, is very flat topography. Now we got a sense where it's all sort of ready to go. Now with a sort of sloppy wet sky, lots of water in here too. We can simply then just sort of pull it in, dab it into certain areas, and you can see the water starting to do its work. Rather than trying to have to paint cloud or sky formations, the water will simply move it by itself. So you get something a little more natural because it's less the human hand on the brush doing the work, and it's more nature herself with the water. And another method to kind of work with this to move the water is to use gravity, which is also a part of nature's force. So if you take your paper off and move it one way or the other, you can then have the pigment chase up top or have the pigment chase down below. And when it comes down below, it should meet the edge of the building and stop. You can see the pigment washing down and hitting where it's dry. And so it's looking for more water and won't go where the paper is dry. So it gives a nice edge to it. And if you see it ponding up in a corner, just go with a dry head of a brush, and the brush will be absorptive and take the pigment directly away from the artwork. So you can kind of control it a bit as if it tends to pond up too heavy in certain areas. So you get a nice sort of wispy type of sky back there, and then makes your two skins of white seem more prominent. Justify this in the page real quick for you. Yes, let's do the same thing for the base of green. There's two large planes of green. Let me get the pencil real quick, just so I can finish this edge. There's a walkway that we can barely see in the distance there, but it's between the two buildings, so that'll cut the green, just a little sliver of white that will leave between the buildings. Then the green continues behind the final building on its site, wrapped around the corner. We've got 1, 2, 3 planes of just lawn area, which will serve as sort of the the need we have to take this mass and have it hit the ground plane and come out toward us. So we need that 90-degree thrust by having the green field at the base now. So it depends on how much you have left in your sky area, because you want some of the blues of the sky in that. You keep that residual and now start adding your 2 or 3 colors of green to get a nice grass green effect at the base. And depends on the season of the year. You can change the grass from being sort of a lemon yellow green to a blue green sort of later in the fall, as the grass has its sort of time change over the course of the seasons. But you're going to need enough here to cover it all. Difficult thing in watercolors, if you don't mix enough in the beginning, it's hard to go back and find the exact mixture of what you used originally. So just sure every time you do an attempt to create an aspect, kind of over mix, because you can always find more later. There we go. Maybe I'll bring a little bit of brown in here to warm it up. Always a little bit of red and green together, make a nice grass green too. And now we'll check it over on our paper stock. That so far, it seems like it'll work for green. And now we'll keep this more of a sloppy wet. So we'll make it wet on dry. And we'll start with the background one. So that'll be the finest brush you've got so far. Make sure the the tip isn't too sloppy. We'll simply fill that in quickly like that. Leave that little bit of white space. And then do the second one. And that'll be a nice contrast against the blues and grays. Now we got a broader area, so I suggest shifting to medium flat or chisel. And it doesn't have to be equal across the whole thing. You probably want it tighter and deeper and darker the further away from us, because that condenses all the tones and values and make them appear darker. And they're a little bit brighter and more transparent greens closer to you. And there we go. Now we've got sort of a nice sort of man-made plane of grass at the base. So we've got obviously the architectural forms and the planes of space and kind of a wispy sky behind it. So while we have the base and the top sort of setting up, we can go back into the building and show a little aspect too. We can return to show the depth and planes of all the walls. We can turn to the method of inking into it. Because there is, obviously, when you come to any opening or fenestration piece, there's a depth where the glazing set in. So we see the underside or plane of the wall at the top of all the windows. So coming up to this area, we'd have a secondary black line drawn in. And this can be done with the utensil or without it. You could do it freehand as well at this point. But it gives a little bit more dimension and size to it, less cartoony and realistic. And then the same is true. We wouldn't see the size of the wall from this end because we're left of it. We will see the opening for the wall's depth on the right of all those windows. So coming from the top down, that gives definition of the thickness of the concrete wall. And now we're going to come back in with the fine pen. The round tip. And if you feel the need, you can actually expand your collection of 3 and move to something even finer round and a smaller 1/4 inch chisel too, if you like to work with more possibilities with the brushes. So now we're going to come in and do a little bit of detailing now within the windows that are closer to us, because there will be a deeper dark that casts a shadow on itself for these in the foreground here. So just like other media, you work your wells from the 20 and 30% into the mid-range of 50 to 60s, and then end with the deeper 90s. So we'll come up to the base of these units and show reflective capture of the glass, of the metalwork that wraps around. So it's not a lot of depth to it, but it gives a hint of the movement of the objects in 3-dimensional space. We can make it a bit wetter and come back at the corner and enhance the edge of what we did earlier, particularly up at the top by the sky in this left corner, and put pigment in there, run it down the side, then go back to water and then run that edge so it doesn't have a line to it. It's just the body of the concrete moving across. Pull that value out. We can go back into the deep edge of this shadow line here, because the shadow is going to appear darkest right at this top of this corner and adjacent to the building proper. And then again, using water to pull that out and not have any line of evidence. Because as light bounces around, it is the hardest point of getting back into deep corners within the project. Do the same here to show that this is all diaphanous, translucent space, so it'll have a range of values inside of this moving back. And the underside of the housing illustration, big block of value. And we can probably do a blue-black, even though fainter, because as the buildings go away from us, we see less and less evidence of the details we've done so far. But just something to start on this edge of the residence and pull that away. So careful not to show the lit balconies, but enough here. And then back to your water trough and pull it away from the edge. And that'll hold that corner a little bit better for us. Maybe take the sky we have over here and anchor that corner a little bit. That'll probably be the edge of where we'll crop the sketch, right at that back corner. It would be hard to kind of break that 3-dimensional quality if you're so far to the corner there. So we'll run the sky beyond it and then eventually crop the image itself in Photoshop, probably a 1/4 inch beyond that. There's a term in German called Zeitgeist, which is sort of the life of the times, the spirit of the times. And Bauhaus was sort of, with the new objectivity of this all, it was sort of the feeling that this it promised the idea of the minimum dwelling. So you can give the most to people by having technology and factory work step in and solve problems for more and more people, to raise the standard for everyone instead of just the nobility, so to speak. So that's part of the zeitgeist of what happens after a major war like that. On the downside with this whole project, in 1933, the Gestapo, the sort of police arm of the Nazi Party, saw this as a threat to what their vision was for Germany between the wars, and then obviously growing towards World War II. So they closed down the Berlin School first, and eventually the pressure on Mies van der Rohe at the new Bauhaus in Dessau had to close out in 1933. Mies then took the new Bauhaus and the language of it, the performance of the curriculum, and emigrated to the United States, where he started at the Armor Institute in Chicago, which is now redesigned by Mies in the 50s as the Illinois Institute of Technology. So the language of the Bauhaus moved to other places as the faculty, some were Jewish and had to leave because of the Nazi presence. And so they ended up at schools like Harvard and other expansion of programs in Western Europe, Canada, United States, and Israel, following the demise of the Bauhaus proper in Germany. So this is set up enough where we can come back in, and I'll use our prior work to show the indication of how we can come back in with the same type of ink work that lines out the base to give you direction for how to do the work. We'll come back in, let's see, first with our first stretch of the first modern master, Frank Lloyd Wright. And as all the images set and became dried out, coming back in with either the same 3-point or working your way all the way to 5-point along the edges, you can pull out in the middle center of the sketch, you can pull out the idea by thickening the edges that hold space behind them. So we'll do the same here by running our 3 down to key areas that signal the turn of space and development of the architecture. So I'll be looking for 3 and then potentially 5 as well, and maybe a little 4 in between, depends on the size and scale. So let's start with the 5 here on some of the most important dimensions, which are, for instance, when the building edges against the sky up here. Oops, and that one is a little bit dried out. Let's try this one. There we go. A little bit of edging will help pull that off the backdrop. All those lines that hold space around the corner, get a stronger definition of that line. And that's really just at the central part of the sketch, because the definition of detail diminishes in the backdrop. There we go. even edge the thickness of the lawn and the parts face us. 2 or 3 inches of growth above the walkway. And now as the rest sets up, we'll come back in and do that bold red front door. So we get a really small section of mostly reddish, with maybe a little trace of orange in it for its brilliance. And kind of opaque because we want to cover up the grays we've done to date. And make a nice fine point. Check it to make sure it's the right strong red you're going to do there. I'll make it a little more brilliant. There we go. Now that's this great celebration of color at the entry of the Bauhaus. Dropping down to the couple stairs and rising up that entry level. And we'll see this after Walter Gropius as one of our modern masters. In the next exchange, we'll see how the objectivity works itself out in Holland with just style and Gerrit Rietveld. So there's the other array of color there, and now we can drop back to our line work here. I'll probably pick out a finer line now because we really have to introduce this idea of the grid work and the laciness of industrial design over that, so that the windows become less individualized and sort of epic pieces of trimmed art, but industrialized into just systems. So we'll have to break this down into probably 8 to 10 sections each. So an easy way to kind of bifurcate something is to find the midpoint, and then find the midpoint for both of those. And that gives you 4 sections right away. And then come back and just bifurcate them one more time. And that way you're always sort of pulling off that horizon line and giving a level of prose to the industrialization of the skin of a building. And the same thing below, find the center point, bisect it. And this is a number 3 permanent ink pen. There's the top as well. And then we can do some of the articulation of the grid of the windows and faces closest to us. And you can draw on the stairs now. They actually come up from both the right side here and the front side. So it'll be 1, 2, and 3 treads, and then wrap it around, vanishing in perspective over this way. 1, 2, and 3. So we see the base there, and that kind of sets up that rise. It's kind of important to make sure this light industrial skin that hangs on the edge of the building, it's makes the wall non-structural, the floors and the columns do all the work. It returns over to the right then. So we go to the right vanishing point at this edge. They're sort of far away. You can detail a little bit in the distance there. And then what'll help, just to get the instance of it being diaphanous, is you see how it turns the corner here. And so that we'll do some values so we can see in there a little bit, but that same details on this end. And so at this end, we want to return back to the right vanishing point over here. So this little line will give us the sense of this floor being floating and showing the quality of that industrial space and the future of architecture. You get that sense of transparency and lightness and capability to really change the game in terms of how people live in interior environments. And over on the right side here, because it's residential scale, it's got these individual vertical spandrels here. There you go. And now for the balcony detail, we're simply going to put in a very fine line for the rail to give scale to the human height over there once they come out the door. And that's really hard to do with the brush, so we'll do it with the ink pen. And that's enough definition to indicate that as sort of a access point to the sun exposure. Okay, one last part now to kind of let the building sit down. We're going to come back to our grade level. And just with the rolling point, use some of the green with a little bit of the blue. And do a heavier line of shadows as if there's some type of, and there actually is just off site here, there's a tree line, and they come in and they project cast shadows of the sort of blue-green onto the grade there. And that'll break up that plane going back. They have strokes of cast shadows onto the walkway. Which kind of breaks the monotony of just the one tone of grass. And because there's not a lot of intentional planting beyond the grass in our foreground here, at least the shadow gives us some sense of the start point. With the drawing in the front left over here. And the shadows themselves, as they're running in horizontals, they'll go back and vanish the same way the grass in the building does. And maybe to make their mark in the foreground, we'll make it a bit darker and then flush it out and go a little bit lighter as it retreats from us. And then darker again. So it's got a movement of left to right there. And so now we'll also then crop this at a point probably right about here. So we've got the building kind of caged in. I suppose what we could do is do a backdrop thing, but I think kind of like almost the sterility of having this sort of the clean boxes on the ground by itself kind of sells the idea what the Bauhaus is looking for anyway. So then once all the water sets up, just go back to your pens, whether it's a 4, a 3, 4, or 5, probably don't get too deep with the black. But since this is such a delineated type of project here, you want to go back and enhance some of that line work inside the skin. And so that's why you can take the planes in space like we did at the Wright building, which is also sort of a precursor to the language, how it gets stripped down more and more by the future modern masters, then enhance it with some line weight on tops of the tones that gives the texture of the material. And its reference point is actually close to home to many young architects, where that plan type may show up in the orchestration of future schools of architecture and design. So if we look at that shape and coordination of this sort of activity of making it a functionalist diagram of how the school works, is not unlike how other schools, for instance, students at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee Department of Architecture, and how the modernist architect Gerald Horn from Halliburton Root, when they worked on this scheme back in the 1990s, wanted to pay homage to the Bauhaus. So on an equally flat site in Milwaukee, we have sort of a ancestral piece relative to the Bauhaus to show the spirit of the modern movement. Again, your view shed right about here.